Good evening and welcome. And we're so very glad to have you join us tonight to celebrate our summer exhibitions. These are all truly wonderful exhibitions. They range from a delightful interactive that I know that you're all going to want to play with in the Songs of Summer exhibition, which is the current iteration from the museum's superb Audubon collection, to our Southern Artists, Southern Art, ? exhibition, which features the work of 25 of the artists represented in the Facing South exhibition. And before I speak to you about that project, please indulge me while I thank my staff for the wonderful job that they have done in preparing and installing these shows. Scott, Mike, Andrew, Colleen, Janet, Deli, Andy, Danielle, and Jessica. Congratulations on a job well done. Now, which brings me to Dennis Harper, who you will hear from in a few minutes as part of our program tonight. And I wanted to say a special thank you to him for being the kind of curator who makes me and the entire museum look good every day. And I always appreciate your good work, Dennis. Now, tonight, you will have the singular opportunity of hearing from both the curator and the artist in our question and answer version of Inside the Actors Studio. That award-winning TV show on Bravo has been revealing intimate portraits of our favorite actors for over 18 years. I looked on the internet today. And I'm not sure what we are going to find out today, but you never know. Meanwhile, let's talk about Jerry Siegel, the artist. Jerry came to us with a portfolio of portraits of Southern artists over 4 years ago. And we knew that we not only wanted to do an exhibition of this work, but we also wanted to produce a major publication of the work, and it was only a matter of how and when. Seeing our very positive reaction to the work, Jerry assured us that he needed much more time to get things done. And so we made lists of places for him to visit in the South, people to talk to get names of artists, and he went forth, and the photographs multiplied. He made beautiful, beautiful images of extraordinary people. Some we knew of, some we had only heard of, others we had absolutely no idea where he got them from, but we were about to find out, and so we have, as you see from the exhibition and from the catalog. It soon became clear that we were going to have to rein in Mr. Siegel, limiting the project to 100 images, which we have today on exhibit. But understand that this is an open-ended project. I'm sure he is still making artist portraits as well as producing many of the beautiful documents that he does of the South. Its people, its places, its peculiarities, its passions, and of course its problems. I want to thank our special donors who made this project possible, but I cannot because they have asked to remain anonymous. So I mention them only to remind all of you that such sponsorship is the lifeblood of so much of our programming and exhibitions. So even though I can't tell you who they are, or if they are even in the room, help me thank them, please. And finally, special thanks to our catalog essayists, all the artists who took part in the project, some of whom are in the audience, and hopefully they'll introduce themselves to you during the reception, and our good friends at the University of Alabama Press. The catalog is beautiful, and you'll want to get a copy, hint, hint. Da-da-da. That's my next line. He's stepping on my lines, and I said if you're really nice to him, Jerry might be able to sign it tonight. Jerry, do you have a pen? Good, okay. Now, if you will help me give a warm welcome to the artist, Jerry Siegel, and the curator, Dennis Harper.
Marilyn said that I would be doing James Lipton, but I promise I won't ask you your favorite sound, your least favorite sound, and whether or not you believe there's heaven and that sort of thing.
This is it.
So this is heaven.
This is heaven. So,
but we will have that kind of James Lipton-like format. Basically, just to calm it down a little bit more casual. I think it's a summertime treat to be able to have a conversation with the artist, and that was really the way that Jerry was working a conversation with his subjects, with the camera, but getting to know them and then capturing their character and their personality on film or in digital form. But before I go into my Lipton-like cards, I thought I might give Jerry the opportunity to say a couple of things before I jump in.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank all of you for coming out. Thank you to Marilyn and Jule Smith Museum for making this happen, and to Dennis and all y'all's hard work, and Scott. And you had the list. You got to remember everybody at the museum. But thanks to all of y'all for making this happen, and all the people who've come out and familiar faces and family. I appreciate it, and look forward to catching up with all y'all after the talk. Thank you.
Okay, and you'll have to beg, I'll beg your indulgence because I have a little technology here of just some of the images that I might be able to pull up in case it illustrates the point that Jerry's making. So if you see me fumble with fingers, just watch him. So I guess really the first question ought to be, how did all this begin?
Started with just my love of shooting pictures of people. I don't know if I thought of it as portraiture at the time, but my first love was shooting people. And two of my dearest friends were Mary Ward Brown, a writer, and Crawford Gillis, who was in the show, a painter. And I used to spend time with them, and I photographed the two of them. And shortly after, I photographed another artist in Selma, John Lapsley, and sort of had a few things going. That's Crawford. And right on the heels of that, Bill Allen at the Georgia Museum had asked me to shoot Lamar Dodd for his book that he was doing, The Truth in Things. And so I did 4 or 5 portraits, and there was a few other ones that I had shot. Charles Shannon was another early one, and Bill suggested that I had this great series going of late career Southern artists. So it sort of started out as late career. There's not many young artists. I do have a couple. And it was just a passion for shooting people and meeting artists. It was so much fun to go to their studios, to sit down and talk to them. But the genesis was just love of shooting people.
Okay. So you didn't really set out to
had no idea
to
that
document the Southern Visual
that it was going to be facing south in
No.
1994.
Yeah. Now you knew some of the artists beforehand, obviously, and you got to meet new acquaintances along the way. I'm sure that most of the artists that you came across welcomed you and supported this project, but I just wonder if any of them were in any way suspicious of your intentions or, were reticent in any way.
I don't think there were any suspicions. I was beyond fortunate that the artists that I really, there was several groups. There were artists that I had met that I wanted to photograph. There were artists whose work I admired that I wanted to photograph, and then there were artists that I just knew reputation. And a lot of times it was an introduction. One of the real interesting parts was I would photograph an artist. I photographed an artist down in Mississippi, and he didn't make the show, but he was one that didn't make it. But he said, well, if you like what I do, you need to see John Bader in Nashville. And John Bader said, well, if you're going to come to Nashville, let me introduce you to the greatest person I know. It's my ex-wife. You need to shoot Jane Braddock, which is interesting. But it was always a domino effect. One artist would introduce me to 3 more artists, and those artists would introduce me to others. So it was a combination. There was really not any pushback from anybody. A few people asked what was the final project and how long did I want to take. Ada Kohlmeyer had an introduction with her, and she said, well, how long do you need? And I said, well, I'd like to come in and sit down and chat for a little bit. And she said, well, I can give you 30 minutes. And I remember saying, Miss Kohlmeyer, 30 minutes is exactly what I was looking for. And that's exactly, I remember getting back in my car after the shoot, and it literally had been 30 minutes. I don't think she knew that, but she was gracious for a very short period of time, and some of them I spent 2 hours with, 4 hours with. It just all depended on how busy they were and what my schedule was. But no pushback.
Ida.
And there's Ida Kohlmeyer.
Yeah, she's up on the screen. She does look in control.
She was the grande dame.
Yeah.
But very nice. And in that 30 minutes time, we went in, we sat at her house. She told me a little bit about the African art she collected, and we went to her studio as well, which was pretty amazing behind her house. But it was.
Now, other artists, you had mentioned once about Alferez and his stories. Do you?
He was the one that I really got lucky on. Enrique Alferez is a sculptor in New Orleans, and when I photographed him, he was 94 and had an introduction through a gallery owner, Donna Perrette in New Orleans. And I called and said, I'd like to come over. He said, okay, great. And I found out later through my brother and other people who knew him and about him that his wife was 25 years his junior and was very protective of him, and she happened to be in Mexico at the foundry working on some pieces. So I went to his, he had an old church that had been renovated into a studio in New Orleans, and we spent about probably 5 hours, and I asked a few questions. He was, loved to talk, loved to tell stories, and he was one of them. Every one of them was interesting. I could tell you an interesting story about all 140 or 50. But I asked him if he knew Diego Rivera based on his age, and he said, I knew Rivera. He had this deep Mexican accent. He said, he's a phony and a son of a bitch, yeah. He went to Paris, he hung with Brock. Picasso gets a big hat and a pistol and thinks he's part of the revolution, But one of my favorite parts of it was at the very end. I'd been with him for quite a while, and I said, I really shouldn't take any more of your time. You know, let me say goodbye. And he said, no, don't go. I want to show you the new work I'm doing. And he was 94 years old, and before I could go, he had to share with me this new project that he was doing. And that just always stuck with me, that at 94 he was still engaged in doing new things, and that's just, he's one of the real interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned a little bit about how you came across some of these artists, say Bill Island, or Marilyn or I may have suggested some names to you. One artist would mention 3, others you knew. Could you talk a little bit more about that process of how, you know, we know how these names came to you, but what happens after you hear of John Doe over in Jacksonville? What happens then?
Usually
Is it a cold call?
Usually it's a phone call.
Uh-huh.
You know, emails is one way to do it, but I think that most of them were with phone calls that I remember. Mm-hmm. I always tried to pick up the phone and make contact as opposed to just, you know, especially in the early days. I mean, it started in 94, so there wasn't much. As it progressed, probably the last few years shooting, it was easier to email and contact and actually send images, which I think probably helped the process a lot. You know, I think when people would, you know, when I'd ask them to sit and explain what I was doing, and I would send them a handful of images. You know, people have always responded to the images, luckily, and they were pretty receptive. I really can't think of anybody that would turn me down. There were a couple of interesting ones, like L.V. Hull over in Kosciuszko, and Nub Metters. I had never contacted them. They didn't know who I was. I just literally knocked on the door. I'd been seeing Bernie Imes in Columbus, and he said, do you know LV? And I said, no, I don't. He told me where Kosciuszko was, and I said, I don't. So I drove around Kosciuszko, and when I said, I'm looking for a folk artist, and they said, what? I said, lady who makes folk art. And they said, well, there's some lady around the corner who has all this crazy stuff in her yard. So I drove around there, and I drove around and kept asking people, and walked up and just knocked on the door. I said, are you LV Hull? And she said, uh-huh. And I ended up spending a couple hours with her, and I'm not sure she understood completely what I was doing, but she was generous with her time, and she was great fun to talk to.
And you just pull up with a digital camera or a 35 millimeter camera? Or?
I always travel with more stuff, but what I like to do is walk in with one camera and one lens, or I'll have a small backpack. But my approach is, if the sitter is more relaxed, whether it's an artist I'm photographing or a commercial assignment, if the people is comfortable and relaxed, you'll get the best portrait. They'll relax. And I can remember shooting people, and all of a sudden you talk to them, and they let their guard down, or they'll get bored, and they'll go, it's like, don't move, that's it, you know, and you wait for that moment. But I prefer to shoot with available light with one camera, and there are pictures that you'll see in there that the light just wasn't good, and I had to bring out one light, but I always tried to make it feel as natural as possible.
And you said that Kohlmeyer sort of gives you the bum's rush after half an hour, but what's a typical session? An hour, 2 hours?
Everyone's different.
Yeah.
I was with Marshall Bolden for over 6 hours, and I finally said I really have to go because I was going down to Sumner, Mississippi from Clarksdale, and I can't remember now, it was almost an hour drive, and I wanted to get down there before the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were a little bit different. I think at the end, when I talked to a few people, there was an artist in Birmingham, and when I showed up, she said, "So what do you want to do?" So it was, because the book was in place. Earlier on, it was when I'd kind of say, "I'm working on this project, and I'm hoping it's going to be a book and an exhibition, and here's the work that I've done, and here's where I'm at on it." At the very end, with some that we were doing, they knew it was a book, and it became almost a little bit more of, well, let's shoot the picture, as opposed to when I went and saw George Doe and we sat down and probably talked for an hour and a half before I ever picked up the camera. So everyone's a little bit different.
Well, I wonder if you have, maybe it's hard to decide, it's like weighing the characteristics of your children,
Right.
but do you have any favorite, or one or two favorite images, or can you do that?
Ask me today and ask me tomorrow, and I'll tell you something
well,
different.
what's today?
But I really enjoyed Marshall Bolden.
I'm not certain we have an image on.
We might not.
Yeah.
Marshall is,
Talk about him.
he's in his 90s. I've brought him up several times, obviously.
yeah.
But he's a portrait painter, and probably one of Mississippi's most famous or important artists. But because he does portraits, he shoots pictures of his subjects, and he has some background in photography. So we talked a little about photography, but it wasn't as much the connection on photography as much as the connection of how to make a portrait and what you're looking for and what's a good portrait and what's not a good portrait. And there was just a real ease with this. You know, some people nobody was not nice, nobody wasn't gracious, everybody was wonderful, but he was just one that was like being with family or something. We ended up spending the whole morning with him. I went and had lunch with him and his wife, and we went back to the studio, and like I said, I finally had to, and there's certain images that I like just.
Would you think that rapport always translates into a good image?
No, because sometimes the rapport was good and the image wasn't as good, and sometimes the image was probably not as good, or maybe it's just for me what I like, is images, you respond to certain images because of emotion. And I've told this story about other work, not this work, but I was doing a show and I kept putting in an image and the gallerist kept taking it out. And she finally said, "I know you like that, but it really kind of sucks." And I realized when we talked about it more that it meant something to me because of the time and the place. Sometimes it was a great experience with the artist, or a great time of day, or just something that, my emotions don't relate to everybody's. So for me, it was a personal thing. The best image is the ones that I respond to, that all of you respond to, and has a universal appeal, but sometimes I have my own personal attachments that don't relate to everybody else.
So it's hard to see it objectively because you have such a...
And that's why I love
Yeah.
working with you and Marilyn on this, and other curators I work with. I love to see how y'all will pull images, because you see it with fresh eyes, and I've been looking at these images, some of them for 94, 96, for a long time, and I get attached to them.
Well, as I was saying to the docents this morning, it was a joy working on the project, but there were some curiously frustrating moments when we would pore over 6 or 7 or 8 variations of one subject's views and find some that we really liked and narrow it down and choose one. And then 2 or 3 days later, maybe a week later, Jerry would send me an email with another image, and he'd say, "What do you think about this?" And it's a knockout. And I said, "Jerry, where was that? And he says, well, I didn't like it until yesterday.
Yeah.
So,
It does. It constantly changes, and
And
I think when I leave a shoot, I have something in my head. Probably not as much as I did earlier, but even now, if I go to a shoot and I'm shooting, there's usually something, especially with digital, you see it on the back of the camera. I see something that I think is the shot, and a lot of times it takes stepping away from it. I always like to look at it and get into it, but if you step away from it and come back to it with fresh eyes, without thinking about this is what I wanted to say or this is what I was looking for, this really worked for me, you'll find some gems in there that you didn't know you had.
well, obviously this is a very focused body of work. Pardon. No pun intended there, actually. A very specific body of work, the portraits of Southern visual artists that you've been working on now for just about 2 decades. But I wonder if we could maybe ease off of that for a minute and talk about some of the things that you've worked on in the past, other projects you're working on now, other subjects that have captured your attention and sustained it in a body of work.
Well, most of the work that I've done, for the people who don't know me, I was born and raised in Selma, and have only lived in the South and very connected to it still. And so I've always shot whenever I was home, but I think in early 2000, Daddy died in 2000, right after that, I started shooting more around Selma, noticing buildings were gone, and I had this new panorama camera,
The panoramas.
and started shooting a lot of panorama images of the area, which made me start thinking about the Black Belt region in general and the things that were important growing up. So I kind of went away from just panoramas. It all ties together, but I went away from the panoramas to shooting iconic images that I remember growing up. And there was a picture of the kitchen that we all hung out in. There was the temple that we grew up in.
Let's come to let's hit.
There's Uncle
Go a little
Jerry,
further.
who had a gallery
I'll
in
just run
Selma.
through all of these here.
But some of the iconic things were Uncle Jerry's house, and this was at his house, and his mother lived to be 106, and they would take turns going up and down in the chair. And from that, it just kind of shooting some pictures in the house, focused me on the house for a little bit, and I did a whole portrait. I really consider all the work that I do portraiture, even though there's not people in the shots. But the next picture, Daddy's clothes in the closet, where a lot of these shots, somebody said, one of the nice things they said was, there's always humanity in your images. Whether the people are there, you always feel the presence. So I did this whole portrait of the house, which was called Route 2, Box 348E, which was the address when we were kids. It's changed several times. And the temple kind of morphed into a project called 10 Jews Left, which is what's left of the Jewish congregation at the Temple Mishkan, Israel. And
That's one of my favorite images there.
yeah. And so all of these things are all separate bodies of work, from Route 2 to 10 Jews Left to the Black Belt, but they all have come together, and the University Press and University of Alabama Press is now doing a book that'll be in 2014, which will be a combination of all this work, because it really all does fall under the Black Belt, and me responding to the things that I grew up with and the things that I remember, and a portrait of the South. With all its, it's not Atlanta and it's not Birmingham and bigger cities, but the South has changed a lot. But when you get into the small towns and the rural areas, it's very little has changed, and it's quite unique and interesting.
What about your earliest works? How did you start off working seriously as a photographer?
Well, I attempted college, which was not a very good, it was one thing I didn't do well at. I think we have some early stuff,
Yeah.
and I ended up in a night class, photography class. It was a continuing education class. It wasn't part of the curriculum, and at the end of the class, they showed a bunch of slides by different famous photographers. and one of them that the teacher liked was Deanne Arbus, and that was second or third year in college. I had just gotten my camera when I was 19, so that was sophomore year, so it might have been junior year. And at that point, I was just totally hooked and was captivated with taking pictures, had to do it. Shot a lot of people on the streets, a lot of portraiture, but she was the influence, and did that for quite a while. And during all this time, I was also a commercial photographer, advertising photographer, and shot for Coca-Cola and Bell South and product shots and Colin Powell and Jimmy Carter and Hank Aaron. So it's always, even through all the product stuff, the focus has always been on portraiture and people.
Now, your Uncle Jerry had a gallery in Selma, and so you had experience firsthand with art and meeting artists from a young age. Did that affect you? Was that the earliest spark to make you want to become an artist yourself?
I don't think so. I had this, weird, this is like this snippet that I remember being a kid and having a little flimsy easel set up in the living room. So at some point when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to paint, but there's no evidence that no evidence that I ever did a painting or a drawing or anything. And even though Jerry had the gallery, I don't really remember hanging out down there and being that involved with him until I was in my late 20s.
So after you had already picked up the camera and started...
And I was really much more interested in, photography is art, but I was really... Once I got to college, I wanted to take pictures because a good friend down there had all these great pictures of going to Telluride and going to the beach and all of his friends, and that's what I wanted to do, was take pictures of all my friends and all these great things, and I'd shoot at Jazz Fest and Mardi Gras. And then I took this class and saw the work of Deanne Arbus, and that's when it really became more of a focus on really wanting to be a photographer.
Well,
and then later, because of that, I started getting more interested in art in general.
What are you working on concurrently with these artists in their studios? You've got the Black Belt series.
Still working on the Black Belt series, and still shooting artists. I've done 4 or 5 Birmingham artists recently. They skewed a little bit younger. Not that the young artists aren't great, but I love my great aunt Pom Pom lived to be 106. I've always enjoyed that. One of my best friends is Mary Brown, who's 95, and I love sitting down and talking with people older than me. There's a certain wisdom that they give to me, and it's just a generosity of spirit that I've noticed with the artist. Not that the young artists that I'm going in their studios now and photographing aren't, but there's just a different level of wanting to give back.
Well, a minute ago you were talking about your conversation with Mr. Bolden and what makes a good portrait, what makes a good image. I wonder if you could come back to that. For you, what is it besides that personal connection? The formal qualities. How do you know when it clicks? How do you know when you've connected?
Well, I respond to them when I feel like when they've relaxed and given me, it sounds weird to say when they've given me the portrait, but if I spend time with somebody and they find that relaxed point where they, have gone from being aware of the camera to us just talking in the way that I like to shoot, that there are times when I've used flash and it's been beneficial, but I prefer, I guess I don't know for sure when I shoot when it's the best portrait. The best feedback is the feedback that I've gotten from family and friends of artists, and they say you really captured them, because it's not even 4 hours is a good amount of time, but in the big scope of thing, I call somebody or email somebody and say I'd like to come photograph you. They agree. We pick a time. I show up, and 2 to 4 hours later, I leave. And if I've managed to, capture a little bit that tells a little bit of story that people, number one, like to look at and maybe makes them inquisitive a little bit and want to know a little bit more about that artist, and I feel like it's been successful. But the biggest thing that I enjoy more than anything is there's a portrait of a guy named Bill Moreland, and he had a stroke, and I went to photograph him, and he moved around the apartment a little bit. He was still trying to paint, and he was painting, but he got around very slow, and we shot in the studio for a few minutes. We went back and sat in the living room, and there's a shot of him just sitting in the chair, and he's just sort of leaning on his hand. And I've always liked the shot, and I don't know now if it's the story, but I got the greatest note from his wife that said, you know, Bill really enjoyed being with you. It was a fun and great day for him. But more than that, you somehow managed to capture Bill the way we knew him, because he was not the same Bill. He didn't get around, he didn't have the same energy, and wasn't the same guy. And there's several stories. Another artist in Charleston named Manning Williams, who was in early stages of dementia, and his family and one of his students, he was the mentor to, said, you don't know how you captured him. 2 weeks ago he was a different person, but somehow in the time you spent with him, you really captured the essence of who he was. Somehow it came out. And that means a lot. It has more of a lasting value. I appreciate that.
Well, it was interesting in our talk this morning with the docents about, different artists and their attitudes about making art. And of course, many of them are self-taught artists. A lot of them are academically trained artists. Some are working in very traditional genres. Others are experimental. And someone asked the question whether you had photographed any photographers, and there are several in there.
Mm-hmm.
And they, and perhaps some of the painters, I won't name one of the names myself, you can bring them up if you want to, who are very manipulative in their own imagery and very controlling. And perhaps you might relate what you said about the photography and
I think I was
how the photographers,
I don't know if intimidated is the right word, but there was it took me longer to relax with a number of the photographers. I mean, I think because I'm being a photographer, I've had my photograph done, and I'm looking at somebody going, "Why are you shooting me from there? The light's horrible." Yeah. And I don't know if they thought that, but when I photographed William Christenberry or Eggleston, it was, I was, a little bit for a few minutes. I mean, they made me feel real at ease. Christenberry was such a gentleman, and it was easy to talk to, and we were out in the woods, and that made it a lot easier. And I'd heard, you hear all kinds of stories about Eggleston, but he was as nice as he could be. But I feel like people love that shot, and I love it. It's one of my, I think it's a really strong image. But I think in some cases he was aware of how he was posing more so than some.
and I remember looking through a lot of the different proofs you had, and just about all of them he had the same pose. He'd let you get a little closer, he'd push you back sometimes, but I think he knew what he looked like through your lens.
Well, I think all the artists, I mean, being an artist, it's all about light and how the light hits things and how you build the painting. And I think all artists probably have an idea of what's going on when I'm photographing them. But I think photographers probably maybe are a little bit more in tune to going, why are you over there? And
Now, you said that they were supportive of your efforts, but some maybe weren't reticent, but they might have been a little shy. And, this image.
Yeah, Benjamin, asked him, he was Benjamin Jones, and he said, yes, I can shoot you, but I really don't want to. And I showed up at his house, and he said, can we do it in a mask? And actually this image was part of a show called Artist Photographing Artist, and they actually showed the image of him with the mask. Mm-hmm. And I think he probably prefers it. And
we ended up with
this image, which I think is a really great image of him, and it kind of, but he was, and it wasn't that he didn't want to be photographed, he was just painfully shy. And
we Marilyn and I, and of course you as the artist, had the privilege of being able to see a lot of iterations. And I know it would have been nice if we had 2 more galleries to be able to have smaller versions of some of the variations. But I think, for instance, we have Hue Williams here, and his was a good case of having a really difficult time trying to narrow down the one for the book and for the exhibition. And maybe if I pull them up, this is the one that we chose, but perhaps you could even
we had
talk about some of the other images and
right.
why
I'm being
you went
redundant,
to the
but
first
everybody was so nice, and Hugh was so nice when I was there, and the studio was just amazing. There were so many great things going on. His drawings, the wire pieces, his drawings were great backdrops and amazing pieces to see. The light was great in there, and everything worked. Sometimes you kind of, every now and then there have been a couple that I felt like I had to work real hard. Not very many, but with Hugh, there were so many good ones, and he just. Maybe it was he was really comfortable in his skin and really felt comfortable with me, but there were so many nice shots to choose from. It was hard.
Yeah,
and I still go back and forth, and which one I like. I love the one in the show, but they bring something different. The one I really love this shot. It doesn't tell you as much about. It doesn't give you as much insight, maybe. I don't know if that's maybe a little bit too much, but usually I try to include some piece of art or home or environment to give you a little bit of sense of who they are and where they are, give you a little bit of insight. I think it's a really great portrait, but you don't know.
Right. And one of the things that Julian Cox wrote in his essay for the book, and Julian is the former curator at the High Museum and now is the chief curator at the De Young, was about your inclination to show the studio, and in many cases it was a portrait of the studio that helped to support the personality of the figure. Mm-hmm. And they were, as he put it, they were at one with their art, rather than before it. And you really do see in a lot of these images that immersion. And even though the body ends here and the studio picks up there, in a lot of these, you really see that connection.
Well, I think probably photographing them in their studio probably worked in my favor, mm-hmm. as opposed to their portraits. A lot of people have photographed Southern writers, and not that they don't have their workspace, but a lot of them are portraits against backdrops and different things. But I think most artists are probably most comfortable when they're in their studio and surrounded by their work. Yeah. So I think that probably worked to my advantage to include that, and to just have them in that environment.
And then, the photography exhibition and the book are both, include both black and white and color images. And, we have examples here of the same image. In both formats. And, perhaps you might say something about why you would choose one over the other.
When I first started shooting, it was the days of film. There was no digital, so everything I shot was with a Leica camera or a Hasselblad camera, and it was all film. And I loved black and white and thought that's all that I would ever do. And in 2000 or 2001, I got the digital camera for commercial work and realized how much I loved the immediacy of it. Back in control again, not working with any labs or to print or process or do anything. At that point, I didn't have my darkroom. And we looked at several images, Radcliffe being one of them, that originally we looked at in black and white, and we all agreed that was a must, but then we saw the color image and it was stronger. And so we just decided that instead of trying to make it consistent, stay in black and white, just to go with the best. And some of the images just worked better. Jim Herbert, I see right there. It would be a really nice image in black and white, but the color is so important.
Especially in his paintings.
In his paintings, right.
Yeah. And so, with him, the scale of his paintings overwhelms the figure. And I think in the photograph that you chose, I think you did bring it back down to human scale rather than some of these where he
Well,
is.
it's a little bit of playing with it, you know, I wanted to show the scale of the work, and in some cases I brought him forward in the one that's in the show so that you really see him. In some of the earlier shots, he becomes so small,
Yeah.
maybe that's when you get
This
a
one
you get a
especially.
better sense of
Yeah.
the scale of his work, and maybe you don't get quite as much of that scale in the shot in the show, but it was a give and take to be able to really see him and focus on him and get his personality.
And, you know, with some artists who, again, are strong image manipulators, this is Bo Bartlett, he seems very aware, in a way that he's composing.
And he was one of the, and this is not a bad thing, but he was one of the few that really was active in shaping a lot of the shots. A lot of the times, you know, he's not here, is he? I was humoring him because I didn't think it was a good shot. But there were times that he would say, well, let's go do this. And I'd say, okay, let's, you know, I was up for anything because you never know when, you know, I'm not always right. But we shot quite a bit, and it was like, well, let's try this and let's go here. And then I would always, you know, try to get back to where I thought the light was nice or where I thought I saw interest. But it was like when we were picking the images, it was a collaboration, and it always is. But he took a much more interest in actually things that he thought would be good and what he wanted to show. And that was interesting as far as, I never asked anybody, somebody said, why'd you shoot Don in his underwear? Well, I didn't ask him to be in his underwear. He had just gotten out of the hospital, and I went to visit, and he was in his underwear, and he showed me his scars. So I'm like, okay, well, let's do a picture. This will be great. But I didn't ask anybody to dress a particular way, so everybody just knew I was coming. And when I photographed Frank Fleming, I think he had been in the yard working for a couple of hours. And some people got dressed, and, you know, so it was, I didn't want to put any of those parameters. I didn't want it to be about me. It's really about the artist and letting them be themselves.
Well, I know we want to save enough time for some audience questions, but is there anything that you wish I had asked you?
Wow. Trying to think if there's anything that I've discussed before, or anything we talked about with the docents that we've skipped over. I can't think of anything. I mean, the show is amazing, not because it's my work. It just looks great in there. Y'all did such a great job of hanging. I was just really moved when I saw it. The book is wonderful. It was more than I could ever hoped for. But it's been an incredible journey to be able to go out and meet, probably at this point, 160 or 70 artists, and they've invited me into their homes and their studios and shared with me their work and their thoughts on how they do things and what they like and don't like. I mean, it's been pretty amazing. And I've met a lot of really good friends and met some really amazing people and seen a lot of great art.
Okay, well, great. Well, maybe we could bring the house lights up a little bit, and I'm sure that there are other questions that some of you might want to ask. Oh, let's see. Yes, David.
Well, for archival reasons, such as showing the art in the background, are you increasingly then taking the original photograph in color and then digitally converting it to black and white later on for a more uniform presentation, and then giving the subjects the choice of which version they like better?
No, subjects really didn't have a choice. I think there might have been one who wasn't happy with an image, but out of 171 is pretty good odds.
Actually, we ended up leaving him out of the book.
Right. It was an interesting story that we won't go into.
He wanted too much.
I mean, I always tried to send prints and send multiples of, you know, here's one I like, here's several that I like, but it wasn't. There was usually not the. There was an artist in South Carolina who's in the show who asked to see the images, and he had some health things, and he was concerned about, you know, one side, and, you know, but he wanted to see the images and have the approval. But he said that up front. But for the most part, I show up and shoot and, you know, thank everybody and send prints and, you know, offer any help I can, and they've been generous. But usually it's my choice, or mine and Dennis and Maryland's.
How many shots would you usually take?
It depended on the person and how. I love to take pictures. There's been lots of times that I've said, you know, we could keep going. There's great pictures still to be had. With Ida Kohlmeyer, I was still shooting film, and I had 2 cameras. Actually, I did shoot some color film, which I very rarely did, but I shot part of 2 rolls, so probably not more than 40 images total. I'm trying to think of, you know, in some cases probably, you know, I hate to even admit it, 600 images. You know, in the old days that'd be 20 rolls of film, but with digital, and I have a happy, you know, shooting without conscience. You know, there's no, so it's easy to go bang, 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 bang and make sure you get just that nuance. I mean, it's amazing how one shot will be the exact same, but just this much, or just a slight turn or a look of the eye will change it. So I have a habit of hitting, when I see something, hitting it 3 or 4 times sometimes. And sometimes it's just one frame. Helen Duran, I went in and it was the first day I'd met her, and I went to her studio and we sat down and she leaned over on her hands and I said, don't move, and I photographed her, and I think I shot probably a part of a roll that day, and it was the first frame that I ever shot of her. And sometimes it's the last frame or one of the last 2 or 3 frames. But so there's no rhyme or reason. It just depends on if the light's good, you shoot a lot. If everybody's having fun, and yeah.
Okay. Lynn?
Seems to be sort of a sociological revolution of photography, with everybody having a camera on their cell phone, some of that causing world-shaking events, you know, revolutions and so forth, and then on the iPad. I just wondered if you use a cell phone.
Do I use cell phone?
Camera on your cell phone ever? You just carry it around with you and just
All day long. I have, you want to see 2,000 pictures of my dogs? Or my feet? But I don't use it for the artist, you know. Yeah, I shot a picture. We were out in Vegas, and I shot a picture of an Elvis impersonator, made about a 14-inch print that looks nice. It's not the quality of what's hanging in there, but it's the megapixels in my phone is the same as my first professional digital camera. You know, it's come a long way.
Yes?
This is a question for both the artist and the curator, but what about these, other than, what makes them Southern? Why did you decide what was,
Okay. Well,
other than the fact that they are born in the South? Or I'm not even sure all of them.
well, not all of them are born in the South, and really it is strictly a geographic distinction. Some of them were born here and moved away. For instance, Benny Andrews was from Georgia, but he spent most of his career in New York. Others were born elsewhere. You know, Art Rosenbaum, who came in here as one of the subjects, and he was born in upstate New York, but he ended up in Georgia in the mid-1970s and has made a name for himself on the art scene and music scene, but he's based in Georgia. You know, some people have passed through very quickly and some have stayed a long time, and we tried not to focus on you know, absolutely native artists, although many of them are. They certainly don't do art that is homogeneous. It's not Southern subjects.
It's not Southern.
And in fact, in the corollary exhibition of the couple of dozen artists who are depicted in the book, you know, I tried to show the range of treatment that these artists and makers produce, and let, you know, you as a viewer decide whether there's a common accent. And that's really why there's a question mark in the essay that I put in the catalog, where I discuss the visual arts in the South, but also in that exhibition. Mm-hmm. So absolutely, strictly, have they set foot, have they resided in the South for some time?
One artist wrote me a real long email letter and said he didn't think he belonged and shouldn't be included because he was from New York. His art had nothing to do with the South, and went into a lot of detail. And I said, yeah, but you've been in the South for 40-something years now. And so it was really, it was geographic, you know. I mean, Benny Andrews hasn't been here, but he was born and raised in the South. And there's a whole, it could go the other way. I could go to New York and there's 20 or 30 artists that I have a written list. I always write lists and write names down that are from Birmingham, from the South, that have made their way to New York and spent almost their entire career in New York. So that could fit. You know, I probably haven't done that because it's a lot. It's a lot easier to get in my car and drive to Athens or drive around Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi than to fly to New York.
But, you know, we were talking earlier about how some areas, you know, whether it's the West Coast or New York or Chicago, where there's a lot of promotion of the local artists or artists who are indigenous or, you know, reside and work there. And perhaps there's less of that takes place in the South. And so why shouldn't we promote and acknowledge the artists who are doing significant work? But, you know, not all of the artists that you depicted are well-known. Some of them have very small spheres
Right.
of acclaim, I guess.
Absolutely.
But still doing great work.
Right.
Wonder-
Where do you live now, and how often do you come to the South, and what kinds of feelings do you have when you're traveling from the north to the south?
Well, I was born and raised in Selma, and I live in Birmingham now. I was in Atlanta for 29 years, and I've been in Birmingham for 3 years. So the South is really all I know. I mean, I've traveled to New York and a little bit, but the South is really, I mean, you can take a boy out of the South, but I mean, that's who I am.
And then just-
I'd like to know if, when you were shooting the film, if you did all the dark work, the dark room work yourself.
In the early days, I did. About the time I got into the digital world, I had quit doing the darkroom work. I was doing a lot of commercial work, and it was easier to take 20 rolls to the lab and have them do it. My studio was in a lab. I had a good relationship with the owner, and they would do the work. I always printed my own stuff up until about 2001.
Bob?
Do you manipulate digital images?
What do you consider manipulate?
Photoshop, that sort of thing?
There's some Photoshop involved, but no, I worked with a guy in Atlanta, my mentor, who did multiple exposures, and we did animation cells and did these, you know, wild put-togethers. I mean, it's not any more manipulated than Ansel Adams did with his negatives. You know, I mean, I control contrast and I control density and color.
How do you feel about that in terms of artistic quality?
It's all about making a good final image. It depends on, you know, obviously news, it takes on a different thing when you manipulate it, but it's all about making a final image. I'm more of somebody said to me once, you're a better picture taker than you are a picture maker. And I think I can make good pictures. I've worked in the studio for so long, but I capture things. And I'm from more of the old school of being on the street with the early stuff or spending time with people and capturing a moment, as opposed to going in with an artist and setting up 4 lights and having everything scripted of how I want the shot to be. Does that make sense?
Is there anything you miss about film and getting chemicals?
I miss my cameras.
You miss your cameras?
The new cameras have no soul. Every 2 years or so, there's a new one that comes out. And I still have my Leicas and my Hasselblads. And I have my Hasselblad I bought in 1986 when I bought the first body.
Yeah.
And some of the lenses were used lenses that were 20 years older than that. And they're still as good now as they were then. So there was never any lifespan, and you had things forever and ever. And
Tom?
I'm sorry.
This won't embarrass you, but you just spent a couple of weeks at the Hambidge Center on a residency working on something besides photography. And we do have one of his paintings in the adjacent gallery that segues into that group, but you don't even have to talk about it, but I just wanted to brag on you that you are a multimedia artist as
Thank
well.
you.
And
Well-
a little southern subject matter here, I think, with the shacks as well.
Yeah. I've done a little bit of painting. I just love to do. I love putting my hands in the painting. And then I'll tell this one story and then we'll go. It started with R.A. Miller. And Don and I used to go see him all the time. And I was talking to him one day and asked him about a piece he was working on. And he looked at me and said, "Just paint what's in here, Shorty." And tell me Shorty. And I've got all these paintings of Shorty, you know. But and I just started working with markers and then eventually got some paints and just kept playing with it.
Okay. Well, we can carry on the question and answer out in the reception, so please join us out there, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.